tell the parents, don't smoke around the kid. So we've made a particular point to make sure that you understand from an assessment point of view that obstructive lung disease results in a decrease in flow rates, and restrictive lung disease results in a decrease in volumes. Okay. So all of the pathologies that you'll talk about will have little tables, from COPD to emphysema to cystic fibrosis. It'll give you a little box that says what the PFTs are. In asthma, the FVC is reduced, but it's not being specific. It's just picking out. Well, generally we talked about it in A&P. In patient assessment, it is specific in that it picks out the pieces and tells you what we expect to see these flow rates and capacities. Okay. FVC, FEV1, FEV1-FVC ratio. That's probably the most important one to kind of keep at the forefront of your thought. FEV1-FVC ratios, that's an important one. If a patient has an FEV1 to FVC ratio, if they're 100 years old and they have a normal FEV1 to FVC ratio, or an FEV1 %, if it's 80%, is that normal? 80 to 120 is normal. So if you've got a 100-year-old that has an 80% FEV1 to FVC ratio, that's normal. So, but we can stratify that one in particular. That one tells us for sure if there's evidence of obstructive lung disease. So as a parameter by itself, that one is really prescriptive. FEV1 to FVC ratio. You might also see a residual volume to TLC. That'll be a number that'll give you a ratio to. But as you start seeing these normal values given as data, then you can. Here's a good question. Can a PFT diagnose a disease? I'm being really general here, I know, but if you were given a PFT, the data for a PFT, would it be able to diagnose a particular disease?
No.
It would help, yes. It's a piece of evidence, you betcha. And we use a predominance of evidence to diagnose. So we use it as a piece to help. But I want to make sure that this is clear, that a PFT will never make a diagnosis. It'll only predict. And I've used it such that, for instance, the mnemonic CBABE, obstructive lung diseases are only cystic fibrosis, bronchiectasis, asthma, bronchitis, and emphysema. Right? So I've been specific to say that obstructive lung diseases are only these.
I know.
But by themselves, a PFT won't diagnose those things. You have to couple that with history and physical and signs and symptoms and other tests that confirm your diagnosis. So a PFT is only a set of data, and it won't be diagnostic, although it can be suggestive of a particular diagnosis. And we use it in concert with other data, with other information, and then a PFT taken with signs and symptoms, history and physical, and a preponderance of evidence, then we can make a diagnosis. But we use it as a piece. That's really the point. It's a part of it. But it's not diagnostic. So we use PFTs to stratify patients and to categorize as either this looks like an obstructive pattern, this looks like a restrictive pattern, and so we use it to categorize obstructive and restrictive lung disease. But with diagnosis comes additional information, additional signs, additional symptoms, patient history, and that you use all that information when you're making diagnosis with your pathologies. Does that make sense? Okay. Well, I'm going to since patient assessment pretty much relied on explanation of PFTs, I'm going to leave it at that and let you get some lunch. But are there any questions? Do you want to look ahead at the next chapter? That might be helpful since we've got a few minutes. We'll actually finish up about 30 minutes early in A&P. Because next week I think there are gonna be some questions. Next week we start putting our hip waders on.
Cool perfusion. There we go. Hip There's a diffusion valve. There we go.
So maybe one.
There we go. Diffusion of gas.
Hey, when you're looking at pulmonary perfusion or diffusion of pulmonary gases, what we're getting down to specifically is air that goes into the alveoli and what diffuses across the alveolar capillary membrane. It's really the heart and soul of, aside from oxygen and carbon dioxide transport themselves, this is where that journey begins. We've talked about it from a structural point of view, from air going from the environment into our trachea, through our conducting zone, down to our alveoli. So what this chapter does is it starts talking about how we diffuse gases. And so in this environment, at the base, at the foot of the mountains along the Wasatch Front, we are at an elevation of about 45 or 5,000 feet, right? So we're at 5,000 feet elevation. That results in a barometric pressure change of about 640 millimeters of mercury. What's standard pressure in, let's say, San Diego? Yeah, it's, how many feet is it in San Diego?
50.
It's at sea level. It's right on the coast.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
It's 0 feet. And that results in a barometric pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury. Notice the difference?
No.
We're here in Salt Lake. We're a little bit higher. What about the top of, in Nepal, you go to Kathmandu and you go to Everest.
Oh, probably 500.
Everest is 29,028 feet.
Jesus.
And it results in a barometric pressure of about 330
Dang.
millimeters of mercury. 29,028 feet.
I'm not going there. Let's make a trip up there.
Let's do
No.
it.
So you see the difference?
Yeah. That's crazy.
In lab, you've talked about FiO2, right?
Yeah.
What's FiO2, Jimmy?
It's a fraction of expired oxygen.
Yes, it sure is. Fraction of inspired, how much we breathe in,
Inspired
O2. And that we know that the atmosphere has 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, about 3%
3%.
argon, and 0.3 CO2. And all of that generally adds up to 100% of the atmosphere. So the only part that we make sense of is the oxygen. We don't care, the nitrogen, does it serve a purpose? Physiologically? How about functionally, it doesn't serve a purpose. Physiologically, it exerts a pressure that keeps the alveoli open. And by itself, nitrogen's in our alveoli. When we breathe in nitrogen. Does your body use it? No, it's not physiologically important. But it's important with physiology to keep the alveoli open. So the combination of different types of components of the atmosphere, they'll make a relationship to Dalton's law. So do you have to remember all these laws? We talked about Laplace's law and Pucell's law. There are particular things that are important about the radius, important about the length of the tube and the radius of the airway. We made particular examples of those laws. Boyle's law. Dalton's law is really the law of partial pressures. You just recognize that we're only making sense of oxygen for us. Oxygen is the most important piece. So in San Diego, if oxygen is the one that we're going to make sense of, 760 minus water vapor, because when we inhale gas, even on the coldest day, we inhale it, we warm it to body temperature. By the time it gets to the carina, we warm it to body temperature and we add water vapor to it. The turbinates in the nasopharynx, the pseudostratified ciliated cells, and the striated cells in the upper airway tend to add surface area, it adds water vapor. So when we're making sense of the amount of oxygen, we have to subtract out the water vapor. So that's where this comes from. 760 is barometric pressure minus water vapor pressure times the FiO2 minus the PaCO2 times 1.25. That's a factor that we're always going to use.
Wait, what's that again?
And then you want to divide that by pi
What the
too.
hell are we doing? We can actually figure out the amount of oxygen at this elevation, at this altitude, of what gets to your alveoli. So the
Okay, so that's
barometric
what
pressure times the FiO2 minus the CO2, how much we're ventilating, times the factor. I don't want to mess you up with where that comes from. But
Yeah, I was gonna say, what's that
just
factor
use
from?
the factor. It's 1 plus 1 minus the FiO2 divided by R, which is the respiratory quotient.
Jesus.
Just use 1.25. The text uses 1.25, just use 1.25.
Okay.
All right.
This is a really powerful example of how we make sense of the gas that's in the environment and how we breathe it into our alveoli and what gets out to our little finger so we can do this.
Okay.
So we can do this.
Kind of highlighted like 10 times.
Flexes muscles. To create energy, in order to create energy, you have to move oxygen. In order to get oxygen, you have to breathe it in. It has to go down to your mitochondria. You go through the Krebs cycle to build up ATP, right?
Yeah.
It's done through breathing in and out. So it'd be pretty powerful if we knew what was in the atmosphere and how we could get that from the atmosphere to our alveoli and how it diffused from the alveoli through 9 layers down to the hemoglobin, to the red blood cell, right? RBC. So whatever oxygen's here has to get across 9 layers and then combine with the hemoglobin to create oxyhemoglobin.
I have more highlighters than pens, bro.
So that's what the text is going to show you. Is it's going to figure out. It's called an alveolar air or alveolar gas equation. And it's extraordinarily important. Your national board exam will ask you to recognize it. They won't ask you to calculate it.
Okay.
But you'll be able to calculate it at various barometric pressures, and you'll be able to tell. The power is that we know what's in the alveoli from the atmosphere at an altitude, at a particular altitude, and how that gets to our lungs so that we can diffuse it across the alveolar capillary membrane. Go ahead, Kel.
I know recently when I've taken the SAE and the TMCs and stuff, you had to be able to calculate the A to A gradient, so you did have to calculate.
We'll talk about AA gradients.
So you did have to know that and have to.
It comes in hand, and it's isn't that neat to know that we can calculate what the oxygen level is in every individual alveoli, so it can diffuse across the alveolar capillary membrane, and then that when you stick a needle in that, you put it in a machine, and it tells you what the partial pressure of oxygen is in arterial blood. That's where this comes from. Is that cool or what?
Once you understand that.
So this is an important piece to the way you understand gaseous exchange and the structure and function of the lungs and how you move gas into the lungs in certain pathologies that prevents the exchange or diffusion of oxygen. So the SATs go down, the PO2 goes down, the patient gets pale in color, they're not pink. That's because of the deficiency in this process. And you're getting down to the cellular level to understand it.
Oh boy.
Okay. So that's where we're going, the alveolar gas equation, how to understand what the PO2 is. Have I told you, normal PO2 in San Diego is 80, we've done this, haven't we?
Yeah.
80 to 100. That's where that number comes from, is the alveolar gas equation. Normal at sea level is 80 to 100. 80 to 100 millimeters of mercury. So a normal PO2 at sea level is 80 to 100. We're at 5,000 feet. Is ours going to be 80 to 100? We have to teach you what it is at standard pressure, but we function in a different environment. We function at 5,000 feet elevation along the Wasatch Front in Utah. So we have to have you understand what our normal number is. Our normal number is 70. It's not 80 to 100, it's around 70, but we'll be able to get to that. And you get up to the top of Everest, the normal number is about 30. So, and it's a function of of calculating the alveolar gas equation at 29,028 feet. With the barometric pressure of 330, the PO2 is about 30 at the top of Everest. Now, 30 isn't conducive to life. 30, you have to take oxygen with you. There are some people that do like to climb without oxygen. They're crazy. CT scans have shown wasting away of the cerebral matter for people that do climb without oxygen. They acclimatize. How do they prepare their bodies and get ready to climb up to Everest without oxygen? They go in. There's a window in May that's conducive to climbing, so they'll go in about March or April. They'll go up to elevation. They'll train. They'll go back down. They'll go back up. But they're training at elevation, so they build up red blood cells through erythropoietin.
Yeah, aren't there like supplements that they can take as well to kind of get their body prepped for?
Yeah, they acclimatize. So what they're doing is they're building up. They're exposing their body to hypoxemic conditions. So their PO2s are always low. What their body does is they build up red blood cells. So a normal hemoglobin is about 15 grams. They might build up their hemoglobin over 2 to 3 months so that it's 16 or 17 or 18 or 19 grams. So they're building up red blood cells, so their oxygen carrying capacity is higher, but their PO2s, their partial pressure is still low at the top, about 30 to 50 millimeters of mercury maybe.
So crazy.
So they acclimatize. They don't. If someone dropped you off at the top of Everest, Jimmy, you'd pass out and die because the pressure's just the barometric pressure is pressure that's pushing down on you, right? And at sea level, there's more pressure. At 5,000 feet, it's less pressure. At 29,000 feet, it's even less pressure. So you're not pushing oxygen across this alveolar capillary membrane. With less and less pressure, the higher and higher you go. But getting back to this idea of FiO2, what's the FiO2 at San Diego at sea level? What's the FiO2 for patients there? Any guesses?
20.
What's the fraction of inspired O2 of people that are breathing in and out? What's the FiO2 in San Diego?
22.
21%. What's the FiO2 in Salt Lake City at 5,000 feet elevation?
Same.
21%. What's the FiO2 at the top of Everest at room air? 21%. The FiO2 doesn't change. What does change? The altitude and the pressure. Yes.
The pressure to make the O2 go into the capillary?
Yes. So the pressure is very high at sea level, 760, but the FiO2 is 21%
So
of
does
oxygen.
CO2 then stay in the capillaries or not?
It does, but it's CO2 is a function of ventilation, how fast you breathe in and out. I can make my CO2 go down if I breathe up. So CO2 is inversely proportional to ventilation. Yes, and so if we were hypoxic, we would compensate by hyperventilating to make more oxygen, but that would necessarily drive our CO2 down. Well, what's interesting about the alveolar gas equation, I don't know if you're ready to make this connection, but CO2 takes into account just that. If you're hypoxic and you hyperventilate, the CO2 goes down, which makes more room in the alveoli for oxygen. It works physiologically. The good Lord figured out, he or she, I think it was a she because girls are smarter.
Oh, wow.
She figured out that if we hyperventilate, it'll counteract the effects of low oxygen, and that'll help to improve CO2, oxygen by reducing CO2 in the alveolar environment. She was really, really smart to figure that out. But that's what's so cool about this equation is that it takes into account how we breathe in and out and what the oxygen level is at a given altitude. The FiO2 doesn't change, the pressure does. And the pressure, what drives the gas in, is specifically relevant to this idea. this alveolar gas equation. Okay? Yeah, this is deep shit.
Literally. Sorry.
This is altitude physiology, which is really, really cool. That we can understand and make sense of this. But that's what respiratory therapists do. This is your bread and butter. This is how you understand the alveolar environment and how we manipulate PO2s with a given FiO2. The one thing that we have available to us is we have a dial on the ventilator or on our machines that we can adjust the FiO2 from 21% to 30% to 50% to 60% to 100%. We can adjust the FiO2 depending upon what's needed physiologically to create a high enough PO2 that gives us 90% saturation. So this is absolutely RT. This is graduate work in RT. This is RT 7600.
Jeez.
Okay.
Oh,
So,
Great.
so this is what you're going to struggle with for the next week. This is
Oh,
serious
boy.
shit. That's right.
Yep. Yeah.
So it talks about
It got
Dalton's
real.
law on the atmospheric gases. It talks about the diffusion of gas across the alveolar capillary membrane. It talks about
The PO2's one.
making account of water vapor pressure in this equation. It talks about the 9 layers that oxygen has to diffuse across to get to the alveoli.
And then the little
It talks about the physiology that once oxygen diffuses
little A's
across into the plasma, it has to combine to the hemoglobin, and it does it in 0.25 seconds. So we know how much time it takes to not only get across this tissue,
So this
but
is
then
the barometric minus the
combine to hemoglobin within a quarter of a second. Now, how they did that, I have no idea. They probably tagged oxygen with radionuclide markers and looked at the time it took to inhale and then diffuse. I don't know. So remember, they're using sea level examples, 80 to 100. That's where the numbers come from on page 190. They're using a PO2, a PaO2 of 100. That's at sea level, okay? This elevation, we're not quite at sea level, we're at 5,000 feet elevation.
So funny.
Our
Shit, bro.
barometric pressure is a little bit lower. So we make sense of a PO2 of about 70, but text purposes, they'll say 80 to
I
100.
need to read this over there.
Okay.
Testing wise, it'll all be SLC.
Testing will always assume sea level. Unless we give you a barometric pressure or otherwise, you assume it's at sea level. So it talks about Fick's law, Graham's law, Henry's law. You know, kind of try to understand the basics. Don't put numbers in with that, but understand the definitions of these things. Graham's law and Henry's law relate to the diffusion of gases across the alveolar capillary membrane, how, you know, what the solubility is, what the gram molecular weight of the molecules are. So what, Jimmy, what's oxygen as far as on the periodic table? Oxygen is
12.
8. Yeah, it has 8 electrons around it.
Oh, yeah,
But it
yeah.
always occurs in pairs,
Mhm.
so it's O2,
Yeah.
which is 16. It has a gram molecular weight of 16. What's the gram molecular weight of CO2? Carbon is 12, O2 is 16, so 28.
Man, I took chemistry.
So
over
CO2
the
is a heavier molecule than oxygen. That's what Graham and Henry's law is trying to relate. You know, kind of gloss over it, read it, and try to figure it out. We'll make sense of it next week, but we'll also understand it over the next year, really. So this is like I said, this is deep stuff, but we'll make sense of it. So Graham and Henry's law. They talk about Fick's law and the difference between diffusion limited and perfusion limited gases. So this is really starting to get into really interesting stuff. And it's really it's where we take away what we do with oxygenation and diffusing gases. Even in light of disease pathologies, we still have to make sense of gaseous exchange, which is what the lungs do. That's the function of the lungs, is to diffuse pulmonary gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide. So that's where this chapter goes. I hope that's a good overview. Okay, we'll struggle through it, but then we'll answer the questions. We'll be much more knowledgeable next week about this chapter. So it's a cool chapter.